won't talk about. Strategy. There will be a great talk at 1:30 this afternoon with those two people talking about strategy. There's also great talks online. Karthik has like a essentially annual one where he talks about it. I won't be talking about that in this presentation. I also won't be talking about how to analyze the data that is collected. So I won't be talking about how to make a pick list from your data and stuff like that. There's been presentations in previous years, and if you want the slides for that, you can just go on our website. I'll have a link to that at the end. But what I will talk about, different methods of collecting data. So I won't just talk about electronic scouting, but that will be the focus of this presentation. And I'll talk about 2056's Destination Deep Space Scouting System. So, what is scouting? Why do we do it? The first reason, collecting data for the purpose of informing strategy discussions. So if you're going into a qualification match and you want to know what your alliance will be capable of and what the other alliance will be capable of, scouting data is really essential for that. So if you want to do a strategy, I'll use for example the 2017 game. If you want to know if your team would be able to hit 2 rotors, 3 rotors, who here was there for 2017? Okay, I'll explain it briefly, but there's like breakpoints in scoring. So you'd have to score a certain number of gears and then you get points, and then you could score a bunch, but if you didn't hit the next breakpoint, you wouldn't score any points. So for doing strategy, you'd want to know what breakpoint you could hit, and that would change your strategy. So knowing how many gears your team members can score would be very useful for informing strategy. The next is finding which robots to pick in order to give your alliance the best chance to win a competition. So the data that we collect, one of the main uses is for creating a pick list. So you collect all your data during the qualification matches, and then before the first competition, before the alliance selection, you make a pick list and figure out who will complement your robot the best, and you need data to do that often. So I'm going to go over now a brief history of scouting on Team 2056. So before 2017, pretty much all of our scouting was done on paper. So you'd have a sheet that looks pretty much like this. During the match, you'd make tallies based on what the robot you were scouting would do. So you'd have 6 scouts, 1 for each robot. And then at the end of the match, someone would collect all the sheets, take them, and then fill in all the numbers into an Excel spreadsheet that we could use to analyze the data later. This is great in the fact that it's pretty easy to make the sheet. It's pretty easy to teach scouts how to use it, and it's pretty reliable. Like you don't have a device that dies. People are pretty good at writing with pens. It's pretty simple, but there's a few annoyances. You can't correlate when things happened or the events that happened with when they happened. So all you have is what the robot did, not when it did it and what sequence those events occurred. Also, you have to manually copy the data and digitize it after each match. So that's a really tedious job. You have someone pretty much the entire competition trying to keep up with the matches, trying to keep up with the scouts, filling data into a spreadsheet, and that's kind of annoying. If you want to see our sheets though, and do a paper system, there's a link there for all of our past sheets from 2017 and previous. Then in 2017, again, the gear game that I discussed earlier, it was really important not just to track what happened, but to track how long it took for that to happen. So there would be teams that they would be so good, 610 for an example that year, would score so many gears that they would just run out of places to score. And so what you wanted to track was actually how long their cycles, so picking up a game piece, scoring the game piece, and going back, how long that would take. Because you could be so good and then you would have a cap for how much you could score. So we wanted to have the time that it took for scoring. So what we did that year is we had our scouts with a paper sheet, and then they would also have the stopwatch app on their phone open, and they would press the lap button every time a robot completed a cycle, and then at the end, they would take all that data, write it down on a chart, and then we'd take that data and we'd plug it into the computer, and we would get our spreadsheet, we'd get our data, and we could see the cycle time for robots. And that was really useful that year. And so we wanted to do something similar in 2018 for first power up. So for this game, we went fully digital so that we didn't have to have the clock app open with laps, because because that was really tedious for the scouts and for the person inputting the data to put down times and not just how many of a thing occurred. So we developed this system. What we had was 6 laptops, 1 for each scout, plus a laptop for the scoutmaster, and they would all plug in with Ethernet. So they'd have a switch there in the stands, they'd all plug in, and you'd be able to scout that way. And this was pretty cool because we could do things like live tracking of the match. So we could like make a live tally of the score essentially. We could see the differential of cubes in the scale, different things like that. It was really neat. But there was a lot of issues with it. One is networking and power. We had to bring a whole bunch of laptops and network them up and have like a mess of cables up in the stands. It was kind of annoying. And then power, a lot of laptops, I guess newer laptops are better, but a lot of students had older laptops that would only last 3 or 4 hours on battery. And if you're there for like an 8-hour, 9-hour competition day, that's just not enough. So we'd have to bring a battery up to the stands, we'd have cables everywhere, we'd have like a power inverter to power people's laptops. It was kind of a mess. Furthermore, everyone had to be synced up to the server. So if someone sent bad data, that could just kill the rest of the data on the server, and we could just lose data for a match. And that happened a number of times. So this could have been solved by better testing, yes, but also there's just a whole bunch of things that were wrong with this system. And so we decided to scrap that, and we almost didn't do electronic scouting this year because of that. But what we came up with instead was a web app. So this past year we had 6 different students on iPads. So thankfully, or luckily enough, all the students at our school get iPads. So we had devices for all of them with great battery life. So they could run all day. If you need to charge them, you just have a battery bank, plug them in. It was great. And iPads, they don't have Ethernet ports, obviously. So the method of communication we used for getting the data off of the devices was QR codes. We're not the first team to do this. I know Central Circuits have been doing it for a while. I think there's a few other teams in Ontario that do it. But it's a great way of getting data off the device. And yeah, this pretty much solved most of our issues with the scouting system. Power, obviously, the networking, it was easy to set up. And if one device failed, it didn't affect the rest of the devices because they weren't networked together. There was no, like there was a main app that would scan it in at the end, but there was no server to crash. So yeah, it was pretty great. So this is essentially how the workflow would work. The scout would scout on an app, which was a React app, if that means anything to anyone. It's a web app, so basically, it's a website you go to, and then you can install it offline on your device, but you don't have to like download anything from the App Store. You don't have to publish to the App Store. This makes updating really easy and things like that. And it's platform agnostic, so it can work on Android, it can work on iOS, even on Windows. And then yeah, it would produce this QR code at the end. Then there would be an admin who also had a web app who would scan in all of the QR codes. So they just pass a phone down the line, it would scan each device, and then pass it back to the admin. And then either with Bluetooth or with a USB cable, they would transfer a file. So the admin app would output just a CSV file, like a spreadsheet, and then we plug that into our existing scouting system. So we decided to use Excel again this year instead of developing our own backend to look at the data. This is just because we've been doing this way for a long time. We had the existing Excel spreadsheet, and we knew how to use it. I'd also recommend just using Excel even if you don't have it, because developing your own data visualization app and a way to look through it is a whole ton of extra work you have to do that isn't necessary if you just use Excel. It takes some expertise, but I think it's easier than developing yet another custom solution. So I'm going to give a quick demo of the app, and we're going to just go through scouting a match. So this is actually a match from Team Dave at Worlds.
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Can you explain the QR code? What did you mean by that?
Yeah,
I know what it is.
Yeah, okay, so
I'm just not understanding the linkage part of it.
yeah, I should have explained that better. So what it does is the app collects all the data, right? And then it puts it essentially into a CSV file, if you're familiar with that, just comma-separated values, and then encodes that text into a QR code. So you can encode anything. You can encode an image if you wanted, you can encode text, anything in a QR code, And then when you scan the QR code, the device that scans it gets that text back. So then they take that CSV file, they basically parse it, and they can do whatever they want with it and output into a file.
What kind of encoding are you doing? You're doing JSON between...
Yeah, okay, so I don't know how technical people want to go, but I can get into it. This past year we decided basically just to do essentially a CSV file without headers. So it's just the values, and then we had a set format for doing it.
Okay.
So it was the same every time. This was all right. It was pretty good with space, like having a small amount, because you can't encode too much on a QR code. It's just like an image, and if you get too detailed, it's hard to scan it. So we wanted to keep it simple by doing a CSV. It was kind of annoying in parsing it because it was pretty janky. Like, you have to have a set way you do it, and nothing really works automatically for you, so you have to do everything manually. And if you make any changes, that can be painful. So next year, I think we're gonna go towards, yes, JSON, but trying to strip away the headers, because if you have like, so it's like a key value pair. You have a key that's like the name of where you're recording, so maybe like robot number. And that's a lot of data that's gonna be the same every single time, robot number. So if you just store the robot's number instead, like 2056, then you don't have to store both. It's simpler, so we're probably looking to something like JSON next year.
Okay. So you did, you said you're just doing CSV. Are you planning on doing like a custom parser at the end
For the JSON data?
For all of it collected onto the admin's laptop? Are you ever planning on uploading that to, say, a centralized server that would be available on people's phones?
Yeah, so it's also a good question. We've been doing CSV for a while, or not CSV, Excel for a while.
Yep.
So we're pretty familiar with that, and it works pretty well. In my opinion, developing a whole backend to look at the data is a lot of unnecessary work. That you basically don't need to do if you're familiar with a tool like Excel or Tableau or something like that. But if you have the expertise, you have the time for that, then it's something you can look at. Okay, so this is the app. Okay, so basically at the start of an event, you can download the match schedule by just typing in the event code. And then what that allows you to do is you can put in a match number, and if I set it like a team that's not in that match, it will tell me. So I'm going to put 3683, and it also fills out the opposing alliance. I'll show you this later, but it's for scouting defense. Yeah, you don't have to worry about that right now. Okay. So I'm just going to go so I can see the start of the match, just to see where the robot is. So you can see here, this guy here, that's Team Dave, who will be scouting. Okay. They're preloaded with a hatch, as you can see in the robot, and they're starting on the left of the hab platform on level 2. So it's all set up like that, but you can see if I didn't click one of these things, if I had the data wrong, it would show gray for the beacon match, but I can actually still click it. That's useful because if your scout for some reason wasn't paying attention, or they just started the match when they didn't expect, you still want to be able to start collecting the data, and you can fill that all out later. So that's something important to keep in mind, is with paper, you can do this. Like, you can just fill out any part of it whenever you want. And it's important to give the scout that flexibility in case something goes wrong, because things will go wrong, and you don't want to lose data, because it's annoying having to go back and either watch match video that you've recorded, or if you haven't recorded match video for all the matches, finding the Twitch stream if there is one, and going back and watching it. But if there's no match video, no Twitch stream, then you're kind of out of luck. You've just lost that data for the match. So yeah, it's important to keep things like that in mind when you're developing the app. So I'm just going to go back, and I'm going to go through scouting the match here, so you can see how it works.
Between the lines. 3, 2, 1, go!
So you can see there's a big pink cross auto line button, so the scouts don't forget. Score on the front, and scored. So it takes the time when I click scored, not when I select the location. That's an important thing to keep in mind. A little bit of a rocky start, but
I'm not driving
it gets good after this.
Do better.
So again, bottom of the rocket, I can see they're going to it, so I can click bottom of the rocket before they get there. Cargo, I can see they're, oh, not actually, they're going for a hatch. And then I click have them when they pick it up.
That's some red line scoring right there. 829.
Again, I can see the bottom before they even get there. Oh, messed that one up.
Falls off on this side of the field.
So it's pretty repetitive.
870 on the blue line, scoring on the second level hatch panel. Rocket ship slowly getting constructed. 829 looking to put a hatch panel on their rocket ship on the second level. That is good. Red Alliance right now up 49-42. 65
So yeah.
seconds remaining.
For most of the match, it's basically the same thing. I'll answer questions about it after, just because it's hard to focus on both things at once.
Panel completed from blue. Now it's all about the cargo. There's one. They need two more cargo to get that rank point. For blue, that's two. 45 seconds remaining. Plenty of time on the board. That's going to do it. That will be a rank point for blue. Red Alliance looking to catch up. Between the two sides of the field, there's a complete rocket ship for red, but it's not all in the same place. 829 having solved their D hatch panel to hatch panel. Now going to climb, going up to level 2. While
So you can kind of see there they snag the cargo.
Gonna collect one more cargo. There's 10 seconds remaining. There's looking like 2 rank points for blue already between the half climb and a rocket ship and
Okay, so you can see there, I missed at the end. I missed finishing the climb, but let's pause that. But the nice thing is, you can go back and edit any of the data that happened. So if I go here, edit climb, there's no end time, so I ended at 0, and the level was level 1. And then just click update, and that updates. And then for all the cycles, you can see them all there. I can edit any of them by just going in here, clicking edit, and I can change any of the state data, which is very important because your scouts will make mistakes. I've been a scout, I've made mistakes. You're gonna wanna be able to change it afterwards. So providing an easy way to do that is critical for having an electronic scouting app. Without this, you should just not do scouting, not do an electronic scouting system. Like I said earlier, you can go back to the setup and change anything about this. So if I forgot to fill it out, I can do that now. And then here's the giant QR code to scan. So I'm gonna give a demo quickly of this, how it works with scanning. I have a QR code here on my phone for a match I scouted earlier. So you can see here, just put this on and boom, it's scanned. It's pretty simple. You can click scan next to scan the next phone, and you'll just pass it down the line. Your scouts can just scan it in by themselves. I'll talk more about this map defense data button later. And then just export CSV. I click on this, opens Excel, and you can see there's a line here for this team. Now there's no headers on it, so it doesn't really mean anything to you, but we had like a pre-existing framework for putting the data into Excel. So even if we did a paper system, it would pretty much go into the spreadsheet the same way, but the app just generates a CSV, we copy and paste this into our main spreadsheet, and then it looks at that data and we can use it later. Okay, any questions about that? I know I went over a lot, yeah.
Do you like train this scans a lot?
Yeah, so it's important before you even get to your first event to make sure you have the app mostly finished and then go through. And if you're not competing week 1, even if you are competing week 1, there will be week 0 events you can scout. So go like this, put a video up on your screen, get your scouts to all get the app on their phone or whatever, or however you're doing the app, and go through and scout a match. Because there'll be a lot of questions, there'll be a lot of things you didn't notice. So yeah, it's important to train your scouts pretty thoroughly, or else there'll be a lot of confusion. Even about the buttons, so when it takes the time, like I said, if you click the location, it doesn't take the time until you press scored or dropped, so it doesn't record the time of when that happened until you do those. So that's important to be consistent between all your scouts. Yeah.
How long did it take to design that? Like,
So this year we kind of decided last minute, and it kind of happened basically in a week. We like developed the whole thing. Not recommended. It was like a lot of like 9 hours, days just working on it. Yeah, not fun. But if you're planning on doing an electronic scouting app this year, I would start learning, especially if you don't have experience with any of the tools, I would start learning now. And start developing it in January. Because the more time, the better, the more time for testing, and the more time you have to get things right. Because if things happen and break in the competition, it's really hard and stressful to fix them when you've got matches going on and your system isn't working. So yeah, start early. Give yourself as much time as you can. Any more questions?
you satisfied with using React or?
For the most part. So for those of you who don't know, React is a JavaScript framework for building web apps. It was pretty good. There was one thing I would have changed is we didn't use a state management library. So no matter what software you use, even like if you're developing an Android app, you're developing an iOS app, a web app, you want to use the state management library because basically what you're doing with this app is taking the state of a robot on the field and putting it into your app. So having a library to manage that is pretty useful. It gets pretty complex keeping track of what's going on in the app. So yeah, I was happy with it, but that's the one change I would have made.
What do you use to scan the QR codes itself? Is that like an app you made or one that was already?
That was just, if you're familiar with NPM, it's just a package library, or a package manager. You can just look up QR code scanner for whatever platform you use, Android, web, whatever. There will be a pre-made one. Don't reinvent the wheel, just use something that's pre-made. Yep.
The QR code's gonna have some finite capacity. What if
Yes.
you wanna add more data down the road, more parameters?
Yeah.
What is the capacity of QR?
They're
Really
pretty dense. Like, you can see all the things we're tracking there, or the time that it's picked up, the time that it's scored, where it's scored, all that stuff. And we could put like 25 cycles, you'd have no issue. You can look up, I don't know off by heart how many like bytes of data you can store, but as long as you're not just putting like text in, you can even compress the data, put it through a pre-made algorithm. There's a lot you can do with it. There's also, you could scan multiple QR codes. So I'm pretty sure I've seen such circuits, like they have like a bunch of QR codes that cycle through and they scan them all in order. They just like, I'm pretty sure that's how they do it. So there's different ways of getting around the issue with QR codes, but I found they've been pretty easy to work with.
You think if they're using Bluetooth eventually, or?
Bluetooth is just finicky because you're pairing and unpairing with a bunch of devices, and like if you have one master scout app that's connected to 6 devices, that's like, I don't think it would be fun. And also with different platforms, like they have different capabilities for transferring files. Like I know iOS, they have AirDrop, but yeah. So QR codes are just a simple solution. They'll work, and yeah.
Wait, another question. So every time you scan each match, it generates a CSV for each match.
Yes.
And transfer it every time to the main laptop, I
Yeah.
guess, off the phone. Okay.
Sometimes we just batch them up because it's a pain to transfer one file between each match, but
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
This strikes me as a blatantly obvious application for AI.
Yeah. In which sense?
I could do the whole thing with one camera watching the whole floor. I
Yeah.
could capture everything to precision. And
If your programmers are really good and you had years to develop, maybe I know I'm not strong enough to do that myself. I'm not strong enough to teach other people how to do that. So, but if you have someone who can do that, yeah.
about
Yes.
a week's work.
How many people actually work on this system?
So last year we just had like one developer. In future years, we're planning on having more than one because having it all in one person is not fun. And getting more people involved is obviously a better learning experience. Yes.
Are there any changes to this that you're going to make sure you guys do this year?
Yeah, I will talk about that in a further slide. Any other questions? So what we got right. It was a resilient system. things didn't really go wrong because everything was decoupled. Like I can show you actually. The QR code is saved. They're all saved here. So if something happens, all the devices have their QR code saved for each match. So you can just go back and scan them. That's nice. Sometimes the QR code just wouldn't scan, so I don't know what the issue was, but we could scan it on just like a QR code reader app, look at the data manually, modify the data to make sure, or to correct what was wrong, and then just scan it, like generate a QR code from that and scan it back in. That's kind of a convoluted process, but that's something we could have built in. So if something's messed up in your data, you can always fix it just by editing the QR code. Battery life was good, like I said. Easy setup and updating. So to install the app, you just go to a website and click like add to home screen. It will install it offline. And then to update, all you have to do is like push a new version of the website, and then people go to that website, refresh it, and it's updated. So there's no like manually loading an APK to install an Android app, no publishing to the App Store, nothing like that. It's pretty simple. And the data we got was kind of useful. So I'll talk about that actually in the next slide. What we got wrong. App context changed constantly. So if we go back, way back here, you can see you might not be able to see, I'll make it a little bit bigger, but there was a different app for each action that you could do. So you didn't have to tap one thing, then tap another thing, and there was no other screens. It was all on one thing because they're using pop-up screens, which are usually typically pretty big, like 13 inches or so, compared to an iPad, which might be 8. And yeah, the buttons all stayed in the same place. You just press them. That's pretty nice. Then if you look at our app last year, as you saw, there's a bunch of screens it goes through, and that's kind of frustrating for the scouts because you're constantly having to change where you're focusing. It was a pretty complicated game for the number of scoring locations to track, so it was kind of hard to avoid that, but that's one thing to keep in mind, is try not to lose your scouts with changing data. Like you want to be looking at the match, not looking at your screen and trying to figure out what's going on, because you're going to miss something that way. Multiple taps for action, that's pretty much the same thing. Quantifying defense data. So one thing we tried to do with the scouting app this year is actually quantify defense. Because there was the rules where there could only be one robot on defense, you could basically say, okay, this robot's playing defense and this robot just got defended. Therefore that robot, like you can figure out who was defending that robot. And based on that, you can do some math and statistics and stuff. I didn't do that. But you can use that to figure out how good a robot is at defending. In practice, we didn't have enough data. It probably should have been pretty obvious from the start. But you have such a small sample size. Most teams, like events, you only play in 10, 11 matches in quals, and then not every match defense will happen. You're only going to have one occurrence of a team defending another team usually. But it was useful at pointing out who was playing defense. So when it came to making our pick list, we could see, okay, these teams play defense. Let's go look at our notes to see how good they were, and we can go watch match video of them to see how good they were. So in that sense, it was useful to see who was playing defense, but that also could have just been tracked by, did this team play the defense this match? Yeah. Data validation. So in previous years, when you input the data manually into an Excel spreadsheet, there's someone who's looking through the data, and if something's off, they can usually tell. With this system, we're kind of just scanning it in and not really looking at it too strictly afterwards. So maybe something like taking all the data into the main app and then producing a score from that data, and then matching that score with the actual score to see if there's something blatantly wrong. Would have been nice. Yeah, that's something to keep in mind, is scouts will make mistakes, and it's important to be able to find them when they do and correct them. Spaghetti code. Like I said, it was developed in a week. We didn't use a state management library. Just more time, more experience fixes this, but it got the job done. Scouting system options. Okay. So, informal system. I'm defining an informal system as basically you have people there taking notes. They're just looking at robots, seeing what they did, maybe writing down their score, maybe not. just saying like this team, their pickup was pretty good or their pickup was pretty janky. It took them a long time to pick up this object. Things like that. And some pros and cons. It's easy to develop. There's really no dev time to it. You just like say what you want to collect and collect it. You're able to collect qualitative data. So that can be pretty handy. I'll talk about that more in a bit. It's not quantitative, so it can be biased pretty easily by your scouts. Like say your scouts really like one team and they just watch them, then you're going to lose out on data from other teams, and you're not going to be able to objectively compare robots as easily. And it requires experienced scouts. So if you're collecting qualitative data, your scouts need to know what they're looking for. So they need to have, it's really helpful if they've been to competitions in the past, they've seen what good FRC robots look like, what not so good FRC robots look like, and that just comes with time, so it's harder to get grade 9s to do this. When to use. When you have few resources for scouting, so say your scouting team isn't small, or isn't big enough to have one person for each robot, then this is really your only option. And to supplement a formal or structured system. So at Worlds and some other events, or actually most events, we usually have students and mentors taking notes along with the scouts using the app. This is really useful for just getting familiar with the teams. So if you're at a pick meeting, or making a pick list, a scouting meeting, there's usually a lot of teams at the event, and you're not going to know all of them. Like everyone's not going to know every team. So if you have notes on a team, you see their team number, you can look at them and see what you thought. Sometimes the numbers don't tell the whole story, especially if you're looking for a defense bot. Like there could be a team that's not putting a lot of pieces up, but their driver looks pretty competent. It's just their pickup that's really bad. They're still a good team for defense, and you wouldn't really know that from your data. That's pretty much it for this slide. Paper-based system. So like I showed earlier, this is 6 scouts, each with one like notebook or clipboard, all writing down data and putting it into a spreadsheet or some app that you've developed. It's fairly easy to develop. The spreadsheet probably takes a bit of time if you're not familiar with Excel, but it's a lot easier to develop than a full custom solution. It's pretty easy to learn for the scouts. May not be actually. Now that I think of it, it's there's a lot of things to keep track of. With an app, it kind of takes you through the steps manually, so easy to learn, yes and no. Built-in fault tolerance. So if something goes wrong, you can just like scribble out something with your pen and write on the side, write a note on there. With an app, that's kind of hard to do. That's something you should keep in mind when developing an app, is try to make it very flexible. If something goes wrong, think of all those cases. Really put some thought into that. Some cons, tedious data entry. That's one of the biggest things. It's really annoying. Oftentimes we would have someone, even after the events ended, still entering data. So it's hard to keep up with that, and it's really not a fun job if you're just standing there or sitting there in the stands and putting data into Excel like all day with your head down. It's, yeah. And lower data fidelity. So you don't have any time correlated with any of the actions that occurred. One of the things that allowed us to do was obviously cycle times, but also we could kind of replay the match after the fact with the data. So we have this kind of cool thing we made for Worlds where you could see the scoring sequence of a team. So you could see where they scored and when. So this was useful for, like, we track what happens in auto, but sometimes teams would score like 2 seconds after auto. So that they were just scoring their piece out, right after auto ended. And you wouldn't really be able to see that from our data without looking at the scoring sequence. Also, some teams did weird things. I think it was 1325 who scored the bottom of the rocket and the top of the rocket, but not the middle because of where their vision was. If we didn't have the data, we didn't have like the scoring sequence for that, and the locations of the data, or the locations of the scoring, we wouldn't have been able to know that, and we actually used that data in one of our strategies for one of our call matches we played together. When to use. When you have a scouting team of more than 8 people. So you need at least 6 scouts to do the scouting. You need actually more than that because people are going to want breaks. Sitting in the stands constantly for the entire event can be tedious. So you want more than that. And then you also need like an admin, you need someone to develop the app, or to develop the scouting system, sorry. And you're trying to start to get serious about scouting. So I think most of you guys have done scouting in the past, so you've probably been here already. And yeah. One thing I want to mention about paper-based systems, you can kind of augment them. So as you saw in 2017, we used a paper-based system, and we also took time from just like a clock app. You could also, an idea we had last year we didn't implement was to kind of make your own Scantron. So you kind of fill in bubbles, or you do a little bit of like computer vision to scan in a sheet with just like a portable scanner, not one of those flatbed ones, but ones you can just feed a stack of paper and they scan it through. That would have solved the whole data entry problem, and it would still leave you with a lot of other of the benefits of paper-based. We didn't end up using it, but it's one thing to keep in mind as an option. Electronic systems. So what you're all here for? You get high data fidelity, as I talked about. Easy data entry. You're just tapping through a set of things, but it's very easy to get wrong. As you can see in 2018, we had a lot of issues with our system. It crashed pretty much at every event. Yeah, you have to be very careful in developing it, that you make sure you have fault tolerance, you make sure your scouts are trained on it well, and yeah. So when to use. Scouting team of more than 8 people again, pretty much the same number of people are needed for paper and electronics system. Probably 9, 10, 11, 12 is probably what to aim for, but you could do it with 8. And you need students and likely mentors committed to developing. I know some teams like Citrus Circuits, I don't think they have any programming mentors, at least I'm pretty sure I've read that. So you can do it with just students, but it's helpful to have a mentor who's done something like this in the past, or even just a student who's done something like this in the past to guide the team along. You can do it without, but you just need to be committed to developing that app. And your experience with scouting, you've done it before. I'd recommend at least doing paper-based once before doing electronic. You get some cool data, but it's diminishing returns. Like just the data from paper-based scouting is a lot of the value. So beyond match data, it's important to not just think about what's happening in the match, but also things like pit scouting. So how many of you guys do pit scouting? A lot of you, so I don't really, I'll talk about it briefly, but it's really helpful to know what types of wheels, what motors the team is using if you're thinking about picking them for defense. Not just seeing them in a match, but being able to look at this data, looking at their weight, things like that can be useful in a scouting meeting. Robot pictures, again, if you have a picture of every robot, when you're going through your meeting, people won't remember the numbers always, but if you can show a picture of the robot, your scouts will be able to remember them more often and be able to provide better feedback. Continuing on with feedback, your scouts, if they're doing, like collecting data, quantitative data during a match, they'll often not remember what teams they scouted. I remember when I was a scout, like I could scout a match, I would scout all day, and I would barely remember anything about the teams I scouted because I'm just so worried about, like focused on keeping track of each action they do. So if you give your scouts like a notebook or a pad of paper to write down notes, that can be really helpful so they don't forget what they just saw after the match. And that way they can be more useful in a scouting meeting, because the numbers tell a pretty good picture sometimes, but depending on the game, you really need to have some qualitative data as well. So that's something to keep in mind. It's something we didn't do early on in the season, and that kind of hurt us. And match video. It's been getting a lot better with there's being archived Twitch streams and things like that of all the matches. At Worlds, there was YouTube videos that night. If you're gonna be at an event that you know won't have this, think about bringing a video camera. This can be really useful. At Worlds, we watched like all the robots we were thinking of picking for defense. We watched match video of them and talked about them for who to pick. If you don't have match video, it's hard to know when you're going through a lot of teams how to differentiate them. Match video can really clarify things. Even if there's something weird that happened in a match, like you can see, you look at your data, you saw this team only scored 2 game pieces when they usually score 13. No one remembers what happened. You look at the match video, now you know.
Okay, a question for you.
Yes.
When you switched from paper to electronic scouting, did you see any change in student contribution during the meeting? Did they remember more? Did they remember less?
I want to say
If you're writing stuff
yeah.
down, it gives you like
Yeah,
a different perspective, I guess, other than just tapping on a screen.
yeah. I can't say I noticed.
Okay.
It's a kind of nuanced thing, but definitely, like with paper-based, we'd always had a section for notes,
Yeah.
for comments. With this, we didn't because transferring that data on a QR code is kind of difficult.
Right.
So definitely having a notebook is one way to alleviate that. But yeah. Yep.
Yeah, and then as you just said, using an additional supplementary just scouting for teams in general with comments.
Yeah.
Some, as expert scouts and such, doing that to just supplement.
Yeah, comments are very useful. Explaining weird things that happen in a match. Like you saw, we had. Well, I can't really show it, but if you saw on the sidebar, we had a bunch of like errors, like if they tipped and stuff like that, and if they died. If your scope can write down they disconnected, or like their robot, like their intake fell off or something, that can be useful to know. More resources. So there's a lot of resources online. One of the big ones is citruscircuits.org. Scouting team 1678. The Citrus Circuits have been doing electronic scouting since 2013, and every year they produce a white paper that goes pretty in depth into the technical aspects of it. So if you're looking for more of like a technical write-up on how to do this, this is a great resource. They also have a talk just like this on their website that talks about scouting just from their conference. 2056.ca/scouting sheets. Sorry. So if you want to do a paper-based system, we have all of ours from like 2012 to 2017 or something on there. 2056.ca/conference. So there's talks about making pick lists, strategies. These slides will be posted there. There's lots of stuff there. And then obviously Chief Delphi, there's tons more information there. You have a question?
Yeah. Do you post the code for the app or
Um,
the app itself?
We could post the app, or the code for the app. I don't think it would be very useful because it's kind of a mess. If you want a link to the app, just come to me after. I can give you a link to it. More questions? Yes.
When you're in a PIC meeting, when it's late, it's 11 o'clock, sometimes even midnight, how much does this data count? Is it 60% of the decision? Because
Yeah.
obviously there's some pretty intense people that ask questions, they've got strong points of view.
Yeah.
How do you weight everything fairly?
So I'm actually glad you asked that because I was talking about that yesterday with someone, or 2 days ago. Depends on the game, and depends where you are in the seating, in the standings. So the past 2 years have been really heavily focused on defense and driver skill. Like in 2017, you could look at the number of gears the team scored, and that's a pretty good metric for how good they are. But in 2018, sometimes the scale will get pretty full, and last year defense was a huge factor in it. So those picks really can come down to how good do you think they'll perform under pressure, how good do you think their team is under defense, and the numbers don't always tell the whole story. If you're in first seed or second seed, or you think you're gonna be picked first, finding the first pick isn't all that useful. It's often more useful just to find the best defense spot. That can be the harder problem. I remember the Poofs saying when they won in 2018 that finding the first pick was easy. They knew they were gonna pick 148, and finding the defense spot was really the difference maker for winning worlds. They were probably good enough that they didn't need the defense, but that can be really important. But then when you're down in maybe like 4th, 5th seed, differentiating between a pack of teams that they're not big names, trying to figure out who's the best, data can be a lot more useful in that situation. So it really does come down to the year, comes down to where you are in the standings, but it's hard to get the data after the fact, so if you have the data, it's really useful for making an informed decision a lot of the time. Did that answer your question? That's also why it's important to have notes as well. Do you have a question?
Oh, no.
Okay.
Sorry.
You ever think of doing something for laptop-based scouting, with Electron, or?
That's what we did actually in 2018. That was Electron. But like I said, if you have modern laptops that will last 8, 9, 10 hours, then you can think about it. Again, you have you could do QR codes again, or you don't have to do Ethernet. So it's really important to look at what resources you have Originally when we were developing the app, we thought it was going to be used with phones, but then we realized these kids, like the students have iPads anyways, so that's a bigger screen, it's better for that. They have better battery life often. So you have to look at your resources. Like you might want to use a cheap Android tablet, laptops. It really depends. Yes?
How do you get data from the admin app to the Strat people?
Yes, so, yeah, to the Strat people or just to the data, to this Excel spreadsheet?
Like to the specific people. That
Okay, yeah, so just quickly, we can bring the data over from the scanning app with Bluetooth or USB, and then in our spreadsheet, we kind of have a page that has a match preview. So we'll put in the match number that we're gonna, like the number of the match we'll be playing next, and it takes all the data from all the teams and a summary of it, so we can see, okay, we're projected to score this, or score this many game pieces, the other alliance is projected to score this many, and that can be useful in figuring out who on the team is gonna be playing defense, who's gonna be scoring, and what strategies we can employ. So, oftentimes, like you can either print it out, a lot of times we'll just take a picture of the screen from this, and then put it on our Discord chat, and that works. Nothing fancy. Yep.
So the apps are completely offline then?
Yes, so it's just a web app, so before the event, or, yeah, pretty much before the event, you have to go to the website, install it. You can always update it at the event if you go somewhere and go on data, but yeah, they're all offline. Yes.
I've been to some events, especially regional events, where sometimes a team gets fortunate and ranks first, and then starts picking, but picks all the actual good teams.
Yes.
And the teams all, because they've got good data, say no, 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 and it sort of messes up the whole thing.
Yeah.
Is there anything that either 2056 or FRC could do to improve the basic data so that doesn't happen? Because that can actually completely mess up
Yeah.
things. That was about 7 questions.
Okay. Like basic data, do you mean like seeding?
Yeah, well, sometimes, like, just because a team seeds first doesn't mean that they're the best.
Yeah, I think that's improved a lot in recent years with the introduction of RP. It's really done. I think it's done a really good job of making the teams who deserve to seed first. Some events, weaker events, maybe it's teams who play for the RP that seed first, not necessarily the best teams, but yeah. In terms of data fitting with that, I'm not sure. I'm mostly talking about like just recording data.
No.
Pick lists is another whole other area, but yeah. That doesn't really answer your question. But any other questions? Okay. Well, I think you guys have 7 minutes till your next session, so thanks for all coming and listening.